How does your school accommodate children when opting out of religion? Hello, it's Simon Lewis from Unshaw.net, and after 5 years of research, I'm happy to reveal some of my findings about how schools are accommodating children if they've opted out. This episode is live on YouTube, but also on your favourite podcasting apps. If you go to the YouTube channel, you'll be able to see the website OptingOut.ie, but I hope if you're listening, the podcast will also make sense to you. I'm going to go through some of my findings over the last 5 years and basically give you some extra tidbits of information about opting out in Ireland, particularly in Catholic schools, although this is relevant for other types of schools. And I suppose I'll conclude by telling you what I would do if I were the Minister for Education. Hello, it's Simon Lewis here from Unshaw.net with a special episode of If I Were the Minister for Education, where I am going to go through a project that I've been at since 2018, nearly 6 years ago. So it started off November 2018, so I can really only say about 5. And I had a very simple question back in that day, which was to ask schools how they were accommodating children who had opted out from religion, or families who had opted their children out of religious instruction or religious or faith formation, or if you will, indoctrination. I know that's a trigger word for some of you, but I jest, all of which are the same thing, which is basically teaching religion as the truth, whatever type of school you're in, whether that's Catholic, Church of Ireland, Jewish or Islam. There will be, obviously, because Catholic schools represent around 90% of schools, a lot of the focus on this podcast will be on that. That's not because I am anti-Catholic, it's just the fact that Catholic schools have so much of a monopoly on the system. It would be weird not to focus on them a little bit more than the other faiths. Anyhow, with that sort of disclaimer out of the way, let's get on with a little bit of an introduction to my findings. As I said there, you can follow along this rather long video, let's say, if you go to YouTube to see this. But if you are listening to this, all the information hopefully will not require you to see it. Where there is a time where you need to be seeing something, I'll do my best to describe it. Let's just start off with a few kind of bits of information for you, just to help people understand and contextualize it, because a lot of people, when I talk about religion in schools, they say things, but now Simon, in fairness now, that things are changing a lot. There's a lot of change. The growth of Educate Together, for example, is amazing. There's loads of choice and so on. So I thought one of the first things I would do, and this is the first thing you'll see if you go on the website, is some statistics around schools in Ireland. There's, as of 2023, there are 3,233 primary schools in Ireland. That's in the 26 counties of Ireland, and I include special schools in that. There's 3,233 schools, as I said, and 96% of them are denominational. Now, for those of you who think we've loads of choice of multi-denominational schools in Ireland, there are 15 counties in Ireland where there is 1 or 0 multi-denominational primary schools. That's more than half of primary schools only have 1 or 0 multi-denominational primary schools. That is hardly a wealth of choice. I think people think Dublin is the world sometimes when they say that, and even Dublin isn't that great. Very few primary schools in Dublin are multi-denominational, but people think there's a load of them because the majority of multi-denominational schools are in Dublin. But outside of Dublin, you are very lucky to find a county where there is more than 1 multi-denominational school, and that's either Educate Together or the Community National School. For example, in Tipperary, there are no Educate Together schools, or Roscommon, there are no Educate Together schools, but there are Community National Schools. But if you go to Longford, or if you go to Leitrim, or if you go to Cavan, there are no multi-denominational schools at all whatsoever. So it's not great. That isn't particularly choice. Just for those of you who talk about choice, many of you know that I'm not a fan of choice when it comes to primary education, especially along religious lines. And as you can see, there really isn't much of a choice. I move on to talk about why did I create this website called Opting Out. And it was based on a policy. And I suppose it was just before this policy came along that schools in the Admission Act were required to publish an admission policy, which would include details of the school's arrangements for students who did not want to attend religious instruction. And there's a specific section in everyone's admission policy, every school's admission policy for this purpose. Now, when I started the website, that wasn't something that existed. And I created the website to give schools an opportunity to tell people like me, families who would opt out of a Catholic school or a Church of Ireland school's religious instruction class, what will my child be doing? And I asked the question because my suspicion in some ways was there wasn't really much going on. And I thought it might be a good idea for open up that conversation to actually, for schools constantly tell us how inclusive they are and how accepting they are and how they accommodating they are. But they never really, there is nothing there to say, what do you do when children who are opted out? What do you do with those children? Now, anecdotally, we knew what they did. We knew they either did nothing and the child just sat in their seat while the class is going on around them, absorbing by osmosis what was going on. Or they might have been sent to the back of the classroom to do busy work, something else, or just sit there doing nothing. Or if slightly better, they might be taken out of class to do something else. That might be something. We also, I suppose we didn't know whether what happened when it came to church services. Did the children just go along to the church and sit at the back? Were they expected to go there in the first place? Could they stay back? All these questions, we didn't know what they were. So I thought it might be a good idea to ask schools to basically tell us what they were doing. And when I did that initially back in 2018, I think 16 schools revealed what they did. 16 out of 3,200, so about 2,800 of them Catholic schools. So about nearly 3,000 schools, and only 16 revealed. Now you might say, but sure, Simon, you're only one person. How would you be able to reach all these schools? I was very lucky to have some support in that regard. I wrote to all the stakeholders, including the IPPN, the Irish Primary Principals Network, and I asked them for their support in this, and they offered me an article in their Leadership Plus magazine where I would be able to talk about opting out and also show principals where they might be able to show where they opt out. Every single school principal in Ireland got that magazine. When I say every single one, I say 98% of principals get that magazine and they would have had the chance to read it. Not only that, they allowed me to put it up on their mailing list. So every principal would have got it in that regard. And obviously I talk about opting out a lot in lots of different places. And I also asked parents to share the site with their school. Let's say even if 50% of schools saw the article or were aware of the website, still 16 out of nearly 3,000 schools in 2018 signed up. When this new rule came in, the Department of Education said that schools had to show clearly and transparently what were the school's arrangements and the details of those arrangements. And unfortunately, despite this, the vast majority of schools, despite this act coming into place, they've evaded that act by writing a line in their section about this, basically saying the parents that in order to opt their child out of religious instruction, parents must seek out a meeting with the principal in writing. Now, if I'm someone who is starting in a primary school with my little 4-year-old and I'm nervous enough about sending my child into school, I don't know the school, I don't know what the principal's, is it a mean principal, is it a friendly principal, I don't really know, and I don't want my child taking part in a particular class because I'm not Catholic. Or do I want them to know I'm not Catholic? Because from what I've heard the rumours that your child is left at the back of the class. I don't really like the sound of that. So do I need to raise my head above the parapet here and let the principal know I'm a bit of a nuisance by asking for a meeting? These are the thoughts I think that go through parents' minds when they're starting their child off in school. I'm a teacher, so I know what goes on in schools where when it comes to faith formation, which is why I couldn't send my child to a denominational school, because not only would I not be satisfied with what they'd be offering, because my child would be learning a religion as truth that, look, I could undo. I'm not saying it's damaging, but I could undo the influence that it would have, because it's just not our beliefs. We don't believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. We don't believe in God. We could always undo a lot of that if my child had to experience it. But I just know the inconvenience it is on teachers to have to deal with families like mine. It is a nuisance for a school to have to deal with it, because it's easier for them just to go along with their day without someone like me having my child opting out and me insisting that, for example, that they don't go to church, so they have to organise some other suitable arrangement, or I don't want them taking part in the class, so again the school has to organise something for me there. I can see how schools are really nice places, and to be honest, they're not. If you are someone who's opted out, don't take this as me saying, oh, it is a complete nuisance for schools and they really dislike doing it. They do it because there's not very many schools anymore that don't have at least one family opting out. And actually, if you are a family who are considering it, do consider contacting the school about opting out, because I think every school does have to do something with you, and they shouldn't be annoyed at you about doing it. You have every right to opt out of faith formation, and you shouldn't have to apologise for that, and don't apologise for it. Anyway, I'll move on, because I'm sure you're wondering what else I have to offer on opting out, and why I've created this sort of guide that you can have a look at on OptingOut.ie. I find it interesting, even though that 90% of schools, or 89% of schools, describe themselves as Catholic. They are Catholic controlled. The buildings are owned by the Catholic Church. The patron is the Catholic Church, or the bishop of of a particular diocese. Almost 90% of schools are in the control of the Catholic Church. But if you compare that to census results and different things like that, only 69% of Irish people in the census identify as Catholic. That is 20% lesser than the 89% of schools that are under Catholic control. And worse, 53% of people aged between 25 and 29 identify as Catholic. That's only just about half of the Irish population between the age of 25 and 29 identify as Catholic. Why did I choose that statistic? And the reason I chose that statistic is because this age group are the parents of now. These are the people who are going to be parents or are parents in your schools now. Half of them aren't Catholic. And 90% of schools being Catholic, it means that there's a lot of people having to go to Catholic schools who do not identify as Catholic. And then the next statistic here is the people that married in a Catholic church in 2022, only 40% of people actually married in a Catholic church. So you can see it doesn't really make sense why we have so many Catholic schools where so many children could be and should be opted out, because they couldn't be Catholic. And it makes sense to me, or it seems to me, that despite people not identifying as Catholic or identifying as anything but Catholic, they may be baptising their children because they may perceive that's what they have to do to fit in their primary school. There was a case, I think in 2016, before this Admissions Act came in, where a family couldn't get their child into a school because Catholic schools were allowed to prioritise Catholic children in enrolment. And therefore this she was famous at the time, Nikki Murphy, her child couldn't start school because there was no school in Dublin 6 which was able to take the child in, only because the child wasn't baptised. And a lot of families at the time had argued that, and Nikki was told by people, just baptise your kid, for God's sake, just baptise him and he'll get into school tomorrow, which he would have done. But Nikki wasn't willing to do that, and this is why, I suppose, part of the reason the Admissions Act came into being. However, my belief is clearly there, if you go to any school, the number of children opted out doesn't seem to correlate with 53% of the population not being Catholic. It seems that a lot of people who don't identify as Catholic are baptising their children, and I would suggest it's probably to fit in, so they don't have to go have their children sitting at the backs of classes. It would be very interesting, I suppose, to see if that was the case. I can compare it, and I can only compare it to the to my own school, which would be a mixed type of school. And it makes sense that about 50% of the students in my school would make sacraments. And when you look at the statistics here, 53% of people between the ages of 25 and 29 identifying as Catholic, that seems to make quite a bit of sense that 50% of the children in my school would be making sacraments. So I don't know, it's an interesting one to think of. I guess we'd need to find out, how does faith formation work in Irish schools? Because some of you, again, might be shouting at your radio or looking at this going, this guy's talking a load of rubbish. Religion is nothing in school. There's no religion being taught in primary schools anymore. And you're just talking nonsense. You haven't been in it. You don't know what goes on. You don't work in our schools. Now, I did work in Catholic schools for a number of years, and I couldn't anymore because of the faith formation. And the fact of the matter is, we've 99.7% of teachers in Ireland, that's an important statistics to notice, who identify as white and Irish. But if you didn't move that to Christian, 95% of primary school teachers in Ireland identify as Christian, so either Catholic or Church of Ireland. And this is self-reported, and this was students in 2019. So these are people who will be in the system. 95% of them identify as some sort of Christian denomination. And when you are part of a particular faith, a lot of it becomes invisible to you. And I think I've spoken before on this podcast about my own schooling, where I went to a Jewish school. I'm from a Jewish background, though not practicing anymore. And I remember going through the entirety of my schooling without thinking a single thing about how weird some of the stuff was to people who weren't Jewish. For example, the fact that you weren't allowed to bring in a ham sandwich as a trite example to the school because it was a Jewish ethos. There were things that just weren't allowed, and things that just weren't taught, things that were glossed over. Even the structure of the school year and the school day were different. And yes, there was Jewish faith formation that happened during the school day, though not in the same manner as Catholic schools, which I'll show you now through this little piece of this kind of little infograph. Don't worry if you can't see it, but it's a little table of the different faith schools. So I have Catholic schools, Church of Ireland schools, interdenominational schools, Jewish schools, and then multi-denominational schools to describe here. And in Catholic schools, we'll talk about, I haven't included Muslim schools here, by the way, just as an aside, and I haven't mentioned Gael Scolanna either, and I need to explain why Muslim schools aren't there, because in the two Muslim schools that exist in Ireland, there are no enrolments from non-Muslims, as far as I know, and there's certainly no reference to non-Muslims in the Muslim schools, whereas in the Jewish schools, actually Jewish people, when I went there, I went to the Jewish school, the Jewish people were actually in the minority. Now that might have changed by now, but I do know the system remains the same. In terms of Gael Scolanna are a weird thing, because their patron body first and Patronica is ambivalent to religion in schools, I think, or agnostic to religions. Does that make sense? Even agnostic to religions? I don't think it does. But essentially what they don't care whether a school is denominational, interdenominational, or multi-denominational. And then even when it comes to multi-denominational, they have some mad versions of that. The latest one is, I think every patron body seems to start off doing this. Educate Together did it as well. The Community National Schools did it. So it's, I suppose, no surprise. They segregate children during the school day, basically. So children who want to make their communions, they get one class of one teacher teaching, and then the rest of the kids do something else during the same time. So they segregate them according to their religion. The Community National Schools in their early days, they segregated them 4 ways. Catholics went to one room, Church of Ireland to another room, Muslims to another room, and then this weird kind of thing called HBH. Guess what that stands for? Humanists, Buddhists, and Hindus. Yes, humanists, Buddhists, Hindus. And if you weren't one of those, you were others. So they basically went off to another room to do some sort of goodness me, goodness you thing. But essentially, everyone copped on. Educate Together also separated people in the early days who wanted to make sacraments and then those who didn't. But Educate Together stopped that practice early in their days. Community National Schools did so after about 8 years. And then Gael Scolanna are just starting. For instance, Patronica are experimenting or piloting one in Tala where they're segregating children, and I presume after a while they'll see the folly of their ways. But so that's why I didn't include Gaelscoil, because it's a mishmash of everything, of all of the above. And you'll have to check with your local Gaelscoil whether they are genuinely multi-denominational, if they say they are, or whether they've got a Catholic ethos or an interdenominational ethos, which many of them do. So look, Catholic schools, if you're in a Catholic school, these are facts. These aren't just my opinion. Catholic schools, their ethos has to permeate throughout the school day. So when you are learning faith formation class, that is just one time in the day where the religion is permeating throughout the school day. It means, when I say permeates throughout the school day, it means that even when it isn't religion class, the religion is happening. For example, you'll have prayers said throughout the day. You'll have visits to church throughout throughout the day. You have statues you have sacred spaces where you look at. There's songs of worship. There's assemblies where there's worship going on. So it's not just half an hour a day. It's happening a lot during the school day. And a lot of people don't really see that as, sure, it's nothing really. Having a little prayer before you have your dinner. Isn't it nice at your school lunch? Isn't it nice to say thanks to God for that? Without, no matter what religion you are, Simon, it's nice to give thanks to God for the food you're about to eat. And I'm like, and I mean, a lot of people see that as harmless. And yeah, maybe it's harmless to people who believe in a God. But for those who don't believe in a God or believe in something else, it's not appropriate. It just isn't appropriate. And when you take off the lens that you have and think about it in a different way, maybe if you're a Catholic yourself, and maybe you were sent to the Jewish school and you wanted to eat ham sandwiches and you weren't allowed, you probably live with it, like people like me have to live with the fact that Catholics, but you would still find it kind of annoying. And the idea here is, and I suppose that's a trite example, but prayer might seem harmless to you as a maybe a not very strong Catholic, just a harmless kind of thing. But I don't know. I don't think it is. But as I would say, a very strong Catholic they probably wouldn't have an issue with you praying if you didn't believe what you were praying or anything like that. But at the same time, look, I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is that it isn't harmless to everyone. There are people who don't believe in God, who don't want to be saying prayers. They don't want to be thanking a God, and they shouldn't have to. Faith formation classes take place during the school day in all Catholic schools for 2.5 hours a week, soon to be 2 hours, which makes very little difference. There are preparation for sacraments that happen during the school day. This is interesting in Catholic schools. A lot of Irish people think that this is very normal, but Catholic schools are the only schools that offer sacrament preparation or rites of passage preparation during the school day. No other school does that. And it's weird. In a way, it's a complete outlier. I've never heard of it anywhere in the world where they prepare for sacraments during the school day. That's a home thing. And then another thing is opting out is necessary if you want to avoid faith instruction within the school day. Now, it doesn't get you to avoid everything, but certainly the faith formation class. If we go to Church of Ireland schools, just to compare to Catholic schools, the ethos also permeates out throughout the school day. So prayer and all the rest of it. Faith formation classes do happen during the school day as well. Preparation for rites of passage are mostly outside of the school day, so during Sunday school and things like that. And opting out is still necessary to avoid faith instruction, though it's funny, it is rarer to find people opting out in Church of Ireland schools, because most people who go to Church of Ireland schools, I suppose Church of Ireland people, the Church of Ireland schools can discriminate against people who aren't from a Christian background on admission, unlike Catholic schools. So it's rare to find people opting out in Church of Ireland schools. Interdenominational schools are a mix of Catholic and Christian reform. So again, a Christian ethos permeates throughout the school day. So they believe in Jesus and all the rest of it. So there's prayers and so on. Faith formation during the school day. Children generally split into Catholic and Church of Ireland. I'm not 100% sure how it works for people who aren't either religion, but I assume they would have that split as well. Preparation for sacraments, probably during the school day for Catholics in most cases, not all cases, and opting out is necessary to avoid faith instruction like the other two. So we've covered the Christians. Let's move on to the Jewish school. And it says in Jewish schools, the ethos still permeates throughout the school day, even if you aren't Jewish. Now, in a lighter way, I'll say, because the day is interesting in a Jewish school because they very much separate the very similar to how all Irish schools were before Rule 68 came along in the 1970s, where there's discrete secular time and discrete religious instruction time. And the Jewish school seems to do that. For part of the day, it is simply Jewish instruction, and then the rest of the day is secular instruction. So you don't have prayers said during secular time, but you still can't bring a ham sandwich into the school, or the holidays and time off and all the rest of it. Everything is Jewish centric. So there's Jewish symbols around the school and stuff like that. But there isn't prayers, let's say, during secular time, like there would be, let's say, in Catholic and Church of Ireland schools. Or you wouldn't have a visit to the synagogue during the school day either. Stuff like that. So that's what I mean by permeating throughout the school day. Faith formation classes are separate to secular instruction. I mentioned that. So if you are Jewish, you get your faith formation class during one part of the day. If you're Catholic, which is the second most popular religion in Jewish schools, you also can get your faith formation at the same time when the Jewish students are getting their faith formation. And if you aren't either Catholic or Jewish, you come to school a little later or a little earlier, depending on when the instruction happens. Preparation for rites of passage are outside of the school day. There is no bar mitzvah training in the school day. That all happens privately outside of school day. And there are also, in the synagogue, there are weekend schools, so Sunday schools, or even school during Sabbath services. And opting out isn't actually necessary in Jewish schools because the faith instruction takes place separately, which is an interesting model. I don't think it's a perfect model, but it's certainly an interesting model, and certainly better than what happens in Catholic and Church of Ireland and interdenominational schools. I think separating them out is a little better, and they happen at the start or end of the day, which isn't bad. Not brilliant, but not bad. You'd be giving it a C if you were grading them in a way, because at least there's an effort being made. When it comes to multi-denominational schools, there's a couple of flavours, but if we talk about true multi-denominational schools like Educate Together and Community National schools, there's no one religious value permeating throughout the school day. Faith formation classes happen outside of the school day. Preparation for rites of passages are outside of the school day, and opting out is not necessary as faith instruction occurs outside school on an opt-in basis, which is where I would suggest is the model that we should be looking at for all primary schools in education. But that is what a multi-denominational school says. Now, recently, there's a few people going around. Now, I don't know how ubiquitous it is because Twitter has become a bit of a cesspit, but I'm seeing more and more people saying, actually, no, it's not new, because lots of people have said this to me in the past. No, but Educate Together and those community national schools, they have their own ethos, their own value that we might disagree with. And up until recently, I would have said, what values do they? No, they'd say they have their own values. And I'd still be going, what values though? Can you explain to me what these values are? And they never... And still to this day, I've never heard anything that is a value that isn't a value already in any other school. I actually don't know what they're referring to. On Twitter, I think what these people have done, or these people on Twitter, the cesspit that it is, what they've decided that multi-denominational schools do that's different, this value that they have, it's woke, or wokeism, or leftism, and gender ideology, and all these mad terms that didn't exist about 2 years ago. And unfortunately for them, unfortunately for me or us or anyone who's involved in liberal views, they seem to be conflated with the fact that you're multi-denominational. So all of a sudden Catholic schools are no longer liberal, and I would not suggest to Catholics there are no such thing as liberal Catholics. In fact, most Catholic schools are incredibly liberal, so liberal, in fact, that there is a new Catholic school opened in Cork, which made the headlines, which would be called a proper Catholic school, because they're so frustrated with the fact that Catholic schools have become so woke that they've actually opened up a proper Catholic school where actual Catholic values they effectively are saying that Catholic schools are no longer Catholic and have become completely way too liberal. And at the end of the day, in some ways, they're absolutely right. 99% of what happens in Catholic schools and multi-denominational schools is the same. The amount of religiosity of the staff in multi-denominational schools and Catholic schools is probably about the same, given the bubble of teachers that we have. And ultimately, the Irish education system is a fairly liberal place. You will hear and you will know, if you work in a Catholic school or Church of Ireland school, or that if there is a child who's questioning their gender, you don't say, you can't do this in a Catholic school. You care for that child and you talk to that child and their families, and you bring in people to help with that. Very similar to multi-denominational schools. But as far as Twitter is concerned, woke. That's it. Multi-denominational schools are all this. It's amusing if people just didn't buy into it so much. But ultimately, the only difference I've seen in terms of values is basically that multi-denominational schools, they just don't hold one religion as truth. I have yet to find anything out there which is any different. But there we go. So let's find out what happens, and this is where all the research starts happening, is what happens during faith formation, because this is the first time, I think, and I could be wrong on this, that anyone has done a study on actually what happens with regards to faith formation and opting out. And as I said, it's a 5-year study I've taken on. And I guess what I want to do is probably just share with you the answers. As I said, it's 5 years. Any school that took part in the study gave their answers. So this is coming from schools, not my opinion. This is coming directly from Catholic schools. So let's find out some of the statistics. So I mentioned earlier on, in the Jewish school, faith formation class that takes place at the start of the day or at the end of the day. And if you don't want to take part in faith formation classes, essentially you don't have to send your kid to school until after or before they take place. And one of the allegations and one of the questions I ask is, and one of the things that we thought is, if you were really serious about opting out, children who opt out, you would probably make an effort to have your religion class at the end of the school day. Now, it's not a brilliant solution. It's not because some children use the bus and so on like that. But if you were even slightly serious or even slightly interested in accommodating children, surely holding faith formation classes at the end of a school day would make a lot of sense, because children who are opted out could leave the school a little earlier. And lo and behold, after asking everybody, 81% of schools hold their faith formation class in the middle of the day, at the least convenient time for parents, in the middle of the school day. Now, I don't know what the reason for that is. I didn't ask that question. The two options are they probably haven't thought about it, do you know? And then I wonder then is, why haven't you thought about it? It seems really obvious to me that putting it in the middle of the school day makes it least convenient for parents to remove their children from class, or it might be a deliberate decision and a teacher-centric decision, because I do know that having religion in the middle of the day is around 12 o'clock, which is around the time of the Angelus, which is around the time of lunchtime. So you can start your religion class off, or in some ways, if the class doesn't happen, it's not a big disaster. And I know a lot of teachers will say to me, Sure, Simon, in reality, we don't really teach the full half an hour of religion every day. Sure, if it even happens at all, we're very lucky. And the reason for that is if you have it in the middle of the day, just before lunchtime, if your Irish class, your maths class, or your geography class, or whatever class runs over, it's only religion that gets bumped to the bottom. And it is the lowest hanging fruit because it isn't the most important subject. And why am I saying it's not the most important subject? Because the CSL study, which I've done a podcast about, revealed that that the least popular subject with teachers is religion. There we are. Anyhow, there are some of the reasons there. I asked then, how do schools actually accommodate opted out kids? So while schools are supposed to let parents know their arrangement, most don't, and we've established that. So I spent, as I said, 5 years finding out this, and essentially the only pattern I could find was there is no pattern. The child mainly, in the most cases, the child just stays in their seat and sits there, maybe does other work. The child either maybe is sent to the back of the classroom to do other work, the child could go to another classroom as the next one, or the family can remove their child from school, and then, or no accommodations are made. They're the options. About 50%, about half the school said the child stays in their seat, and then it was a mix of everything else, under 20% for the rest of them. In terms of the alternative work being provided by the teacher, about half of schools do that, and about 20% of schools allow the family to provide alternative work. I don't know what the other 25 or so percent of children do. I'm assuming they either have to sit there and learn and just take part, or choose not to and just sit there bored. I don't know. But they're the percentages. I don't know if that's a big takeaway for you, but if you're basically supposedly accommodating opted out kids, what do they do during that time and where do they sit? I think it's important to answer those kind of questions, even as a teacher, to find out whether you're really being in any way tolerant or accommodating. We'll move on to school uniforms, because this is something people don't really think about. A lot of school uniforms, I suspect, have a religious symbol on them, a cross. And I suppose if you get children designing the crest of their school uniform, it's very interesting to note that I haven't come across it. I often see posts on social media of our new school crest, the children designed. I don't think I've ever seen a religious symbol on them, but I still think the 51% is quite a low percentage. But anyway, that aside, they say 51%. I think it's lower. It probably is a little higher than that. Do people recognise certain symbols as religious and so on like that? But more interestingly than all that was whether it was optional to wear the uniform crest if it contained a religious symbol. And what I found interesting, because, for example, ask me to wear a crucifix is really offensive, particularly if I still practiced the religion I was brought up in. To ask me or to force me to wear a crucifix is just an abomination. And I certainly is something I would definitely press. I don't like uniforms anyway, but I do know my son is going to have to wear one in secondary school, and I am going to have to, I'd love to make a fuss of it, but for his sake, I'm not. But if the school he went to was a denominational secondary school and there was a cross on it, I would say to the school, he's not wearing the crest. It's just not happening. And they'd have to respect that, in my opinion. But maybe they wouldn't respect it. They say, maybe find another school. But at the end of the day, I think that's one I'd push to someone's quality commission. But anyway, thankfully, you don't have me coming to your school. And interestingly, only 8% of respondents who had a religious symbol on their crest said that it was optional. So there were a lot of kids who are not Christians wearing crucifixes, and I just think that's really offensive. It's like, you would call, if it was a Catholic in a Muslim school wearing a hijab, you'd be calling it cultural appropriation. And in this case, or you'd be calling it oppression, one or the other. I don't know. But I don't know what you would think. It's interesting to think about it, but only 8% of schools allow someone not wear the crest if it has a religious symbol. Let's move on to church visits, because this is another thing. A lot of schools have church visits. And in most denominational schools that happens. It forms part of the school year, particularly during sacrament preparation. And it can range from weekly to less often, or even more often depending on the school. And it mostly involves, if you go to a church, you're mostly going to be involved in a prayer service, and families are entitled to opt their child out of any form of worship. However, schools are not required to make any special accommodations short of not forcing the child to join in the worship. So we asked the schools to report on the accommodations they make, and again, much like previously, there isn't any consistency. In fact, no school scored no accommodation was more than 50%. So about 40% of schools said the pupils could stay in school supervised, which I was surprised about. I didn't think that many would. Pupils were allowed to sit at the back of the church was the next most chosen. Families could collect the pupils at those times was an option, which is, I always say, is a nasty kind of one where you're inconveniencing parents. And schools will inform families of visits within 24 hours so they can choose whether to send their child in or not, which is another kind of, I would suggest, mean kind of thing for schools. I just thought, if you've got a kid in your class, it's telling them to be picked up or not come to school on a day when they're going to church, essentially tells you you're not really part of our class. You're just a visitor here, and you can stay most of the time. Then when it came to other, which is less than 10%, I looked into that a little bit more. Other was either a case-by-case basis or that the issue had not arisen, essentially was what they said they didn't have. And some other people also said that they don't visit the church. That's fair enough. Not every school is built on a church ground, but lots are. When it comes to school assemblies, because again, people might think, school assemblies are not religious at all. But I remember a school I was in, every school assembly had prayers, songs of worship, and that's problematic for somebody who has opted out, or for a family that's opted out. There are times when children come together as a community, and they're often addressed by the principal. Sometimes there's a performance by a class, and in many cases there is collective worship. So how many people can opt out? So let's see. Could you opt out? No, in 65% of cases. If there is a religious focus, yes, in 20% of cases. Only 2%, 2.75% you could opt out of assembly. It's very low. There was the other thing, and the other was mainly because the school didn't host assemblies. And that's not surprising because many schools do not have school halls where it's easy to bring all the children in together. But very interesting that only just over 2.5% of schools allow opting out of assembly. And if there is a religious element to it, they will let them opt out, 20% only. But generally, 65%, so 2 out of 3 schools do not force, basically they do force children to take part in an assembly where there is collective worship. So we're seeing that opting out from this research is not as straightforward as one might think. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, and it isn't just about the faith formation class. There are lots of parts of the day where opting out is needed. When it came down to it, really, ultimately, the big headline, let's say if there's to be a headline in this, and maybe we'll choose a different headline, but when I was doing the research, I asked schools, did they have a defined policy on opting out from religion? Did they use that silly line that basically says you have to book an appointment? Effectively, and I don't know how accurate this figure is, but it's the only figure that we have. There's one other study from Atheist Ireland which came in a different figure. They looked at 100 sample schools. We've asked every school in the country whether they have a defined policy from opting out of religion, and only 12% of schools in Ireland say they have a defined policy on opting out from religion. What does that say about how much schools care about opting out of religion? If you have a child protection policy, let's say, and it's a policy like any other policy, if you have a health and safety policy, if you have a homework policy and so on, I wonder, actually, speaking of homework, how many schools have a homework policy? I would suggest close to 100% of schools would have a homework policy, even though it is not compulsory. An defined policy on opting out from religion is compulsory, yet only 12% of schools actually have one. It says everything to me. It should be 100% of schools. It should be as bad to not have a child protection policy, to not have an opting out policy. It's not okay not to have one. But it seems collectively Ireland has decided, meh, I don't care. So really, what next? We have all the facts now. These are from the horse's mouth, from the Catholic school's own mouth. I'm going to be keeping the website up here forever and ever. And the idea is that you can have these facts forever. We'll see how they change over time, maybe. But apart from that, there are other parts of the website that you might be interested in. I talk about religion in schools. How does religion actually work in schools? And it's written in a non-emotive way. I know I'm quite emotive and quite passionate about the role of faith instruction and faith formation and all and the other definitions or the other synonyms of that. And so I have a section on actually what happens in schools. I have a correspondence section, which is basically outlines the people I sought out for help and how they reacted. In a way, in some ways, it was just to show who cares, even from the representative bodies. There's a blog with loads of interesting, somewhat interesting, well, I think they're interesting articles, sample letters for opting out of certain things, just statistics around the different families, same love competition, about lots of different posts. Even one, I think, during COVID, I wrote, my favourite article that I wrote on this was called Today Should Have Been Your Communion. It was a letter actually to people in Catholic schools who should have made their communion but didn't during the day, and what could have happened and what should have happened, and how much really do people, it really was a kind of, there was no reason why sacraments couldn't have happened during COVID times. Not because I'm against COVID or anything like that, but it might be an interesting one for you to look at. And there's lots of other little articles as well that might be of interest to parents or teachers and so on. And then we have sections with information, just a little bit about who I am and my context and why I set up the website, and even just a little bit of a story about me and my own family context and how opting out, even though I don't work in a Catholic school and even though my child doesn't go to a Catholic school, how it still affects me and my child. I have a section for parents for schools, for teachers within that, about them opting out, because I did some studies on teachers whether they can opt out of faith formation. The answer is no. Essentially, very few schools allow their teachers to not teach faith formation, and there's reasons why lots of teachers don't ask not to teach faith formation. So there's a section as well asking how representative bodies can help in terms of opting out, and that might be worth your while having a look at. But most important is, if I were the Minister for Education, what would we do next? Well, what should happen next? Given the only option really is available to families is to attend a school with religious ethos, where they can opt out of explicit religious instruction. The statistics that I've gathered over the last 5 years demonstrate there is no consistency. And despite the government requiring schools to explicitly state how they accommodate opted out families, it's not happening in the vast majority of schools. Ultimately, there should be no such thing as opting out, in my view. Every child should be able to take part in every aspect of their own school day. And I guess if you are listening to this and you are affected or you're interested in tackling those issues, there's not much I can do. I am one person. I'm very lucky. I don't risk losing my job, because ultimately, if I was teaching in a Catholic school, I could be fired for doing this podcast. It's a reason why a lot of teachers don't speak out. We live in a don't ask, don't tell education system where you can be fired legally for undermining the ethos. So me speaking out, if I worked in a denominational school, would be difficult. So why am I doing it? Because of the thousands of teachers I talk to who cannot speak out. In fact, only recently I attended a little webinar where teachers were invited to talk about their experiences of not being religious, and it's funny, I knew everyone there, and lots of people just backed out because they were too nervous about being seen. I was at an INTO meeting where basically there was a motion to remove religion from schools, more or less. There was more to it than that. But when it came to the vote, anyone with a temporary job in the room didn't vote. They abstained from voting. So you can see the evidence is always there anecdotally. This is why I suppose I'm doing it. But if you are interested in getting involved and you don't mind, look, ultimately my prediction is if you do get involved and you're in a permanent position, there's not much that's going to happen to you. But there are some, rather than joining me, I'm not going to set up my own group. There are a couple of groups that actually exist that might be of worth while to you. Education Equality is a group I'm involved in. I think it's well worth looking into them. They have a petition going for the last few years for their equal access, equal respect. Teach Don't Preach is a branch of Atheist Ireland. I think Atheist Ireland, they're looking for a secular education system. I'm not particularly I'm not interested in a secular education system, so I don't fully agree with their motives. But many of you, I agree again with this. And I don't think we're splitting straws or anything like that, but I would say about 95% of what they say I agree with. And the Humanist Association of Ireland have some really interesting stories from parents, and you might want to share your own story anonymously with them about opting out of religion. There are other places, of course, like Raising Children Without Religion on Facebook, and I'm sure there are various other places out there that I don't know about. But really, ultimately, you've got the stats. They're the facts. They're undeniable. It's not okay, in my view, that this has to carry on. Opting out is a myth. It's a facade, I think, at very best. And if I were the Minister for Education, I'd be doing a number of things. Ultimately, I would be removing patronage. Patronage is, for almost every problem in the education system, patronage is the reason. I would be looking for a multi-denominational, state-run school system. However, realistically, that could happen tomorrow. I know it could happen tomorrow, and I've given loads of examples of how it could happen tomorrow. But realistically, I don't see it happening. But the one thing I could do as a Minister for Education is what I promised I would do when the Education Act came out. And that would be to insist that all schools would explicitly state how they accommodate children who are going to be opted out of religion, and that will be publicly displayed on every school's website. So that's it from me. I've loads more to say on this, as I always do. It's probably nothing new that you've said, but this time I'm backing it up with 5 years of research, which I hope is of interest to you. I hope you enjoyed this. If you're watching on video, let me know if it worked for you, if you liked seeing the site while I was talking through it, or even if you were listening to the podcast, if it worked for you as well, without the visual aid of it. It's really important to me. It takes me ages to do the video compared to the audio, so I'll stop doing the video if people aren't bothering watching it. However, anyway, either way, if you like this, as young folks say, smash the subscribe button. Is that what they say? I don't know. Anyway, do that on YouTube. Don't smash any subscribe button on a podcast, because that isn't what you do, apparently. What you do is you just subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcasting host, whatever that might be. Anyway, thanks so much for listening or watching. And until next time, all the very best.